When governments announce military decisions, most people focus on what is said. I prefer to focus on what follows. In geopolitics, the most revealing moments often come after the headlines fade, when actions, responses, and silence begin telling a different story. Recently, one public announcement suggested that planned military action would be suspended while diplomacy was given another opportunity. On the surface, that appeared to be a step toward de-escalation. But when I compared official statements, regional developments, and activity across one of the world's most strategic waterways, I found a far more complicated picture. The first question we should ask is simple. What changes on the ground when diplomacy is truly making progress? Normally, genuine de-escalation produces visible signals. Military activity slows. Shipping risks begin to decline. Diplomatic communication becomes more consistent. And both sides gradually reduce the intensity of their public messaging. These indicators create confidence that tensions are moving in a more stable direction. Yet during this period, commercial shipping continued facing uncertainty. Security concerns remain elevated around the Strait of Hormuz, and regional governments continue preparing for multiple scenarios. That contrast deserves careful attention because markets, shipping companies, and military planners respond to actual conditions rather than optimistic headlines. Another important lesson is that modern geopolitical competition is no longer defined only by military strength. Economic pressure, maritime logistics, energy infrastructure, financial markets, cybersecurity, and diplomatic influence now operate together as part of a single strategic system. A decision that appears diplomatic on the surface may also reflect economic calculations, alliance management, domestic political considerations, and concerns about long-term regional stability. Understanding these overlapping pressures is essential before drawing conclusions about any major policy shift. Equally important is the role of strategic communication. Public announcements influence far more than international audiences. They shape financial markets, reassure allies, influence domestic opinion, and affect expectations among adversaries. Every carefully chosen sentence carries political consequences. Once leaders publicly commit themselves to a particular direction, they create expectations that become increasingly difficult to reverse if events develop differently. This is why I pay close attention not only to statements themselves, but also to the responses they receive, or sometimes the responses they do not receive. In international politics, silence can become a strategic instrument of its own. While one government communicates openly, another may deliberately choose patience, allowing uncertainty itself to influence negotiations and public perception. The result is a strategic environment where perception, timing, and credibility become just as important as military capability. To understand what may happen next, we must examine not only what was announced, but also why the broader regional picture remains far more complex than the headlines initially suggested. When I study prolonged geopolitical confrontations, I always return to one principle. Military capability alone rarely determines strategic success. What matters just as much is whether each side can maintain credibility, sustain pressure, and preserve flexibility without creating unintended consequences. One of the clearest lessons from this episode is how rapidly political decisions can influence international perceptions. A single public announcement can affect financial markets, energy prices, diplomatic calculations, and alliance coordination within hours. Yet those immediate reactions do not necessarily reveal how negotiations are progressing behind the scenes. They simply reflect changing expectations, which can evolve just as quickly as the headlines themselves. Another important observation concerns regional diplomacy. The Middle East is no longer shaped only by direct confrontation between two governments. Neighboring states, energy producers, shipping companies, and major international powers all have significant interests in preventing instability from spreading further. Their diplomatic engagement often takes place quietly, away from public attention. But those conversations can influence strategic decisions just as much as military developments. Modern crises are increasingly managed through overlapping networks of diplomacy rather than through bilateral negotiations alone. Economic considerations also deserve equal attention. Prolonged instability affects insurance costs, commercial shipping, energy markets, investment confidence, and global supply chains. Even limited disruptions around strategic maritime corridors can produce consequences extending far beyond the immediate region. This is why governments must continuously balance military objectives against broader economic realities. Strategic success depends not only on battlefield outcomes, but also on preserving long-term national resilience. Perhaps the most significant lesson is the value of patience. International negotiations often advance unevenly. Public messaging may suggest momentum, while practical implementation remains uncertain. Some governments choose to communicate frequently, others prefer measured silence while evaluating their options. Neither approach alone confirms success or failure. What ultimately matters is whether later actions support earlier statements. For analysts, this distinction is essential. Rather than reacting to every announcement, we should observe patterns over time. Changes in shipping activity, diplomatic engagement, military deployments, economic indicators, and regional stability. These measurable developments provide a stronger foundation for understanding strategic direction than any single headline. Ultimately, I believe this episode reflects a broader transformation in modern geopolitics. Power today is exercised not only through military force, but also through economic resilience, diplomatic influence, strategic communication, and the ability to shape international expectations. Governments that successfully integrate these instruments often gain advantages that extend well beyond the battlefield. History reminds us that lasting geopolitical outcomes are rarely decided by one announcement or one dramatic event. They emerge gradually through credibility, consistency, and strategic patience. In a rapidly changing international environment, those qualities may prove more influential than any single military operation. And that is the larger lesson we should continue watching in the months ahead.